The air in Whitehall was never sweet. Even in winter, when frost silenced the city stinks, the palace reeked of damp timber sweat from packed courtiers and smoke from countless hearths. But in January of 1547, the odour that seeped from the king's chambers was something else entirely thick, fetid, unmistakable. It was the smell of rot so sharp and invasive that hardened men gagged as they drew near, and ladies pressed pomanders of clove and rose oil desperately to their noses. Some could not endure it at all, and turned away murmuring excuses. Yet no one dared name the truth aloud. Their monarch, once called the handsomest prince in Christendom, was decaying while still alive. The official proclamations told another story. Messengers galloped across the realm declaring that Henry was merely resting after a minor ailment and that his recovery was expected soon. Ambassadors summoned to court were ushered into outer halls entertained with music and ceremony and assured that the sovereign's absence was temporary. The lie was necessary. England could not be seen without a functioning king, especially not this king who had torn his country from the Pope's embrace, executed wives and nobles alike, and rebuilt the monarchy on sheer personal will. For him to appear weak or worse, already fading, was to invite chaos. Behind the velvet curtains, though, there was no mistaking the reality. Those few physicians and servants allowed near his bed wrote of wounds that would not close, of legs swollen and blackened, of fluids seeping through linens faster than they could be changed. The smell they admitted was overpowering. Modern medicine has a word for it: gangrene. To Tudor courtiers it was simpler, starker, the stench of death already claiming its prize. It is tempting to imagine Henry's end as the natural course of a gluttonous, tyrannical life, a man undone by his appetites. But that is too simple. His deterioration was not a straight path of indulgence, but a spiral triggered by one brutal moment of chance, a tilt-yard accident that cracked not only his skull but his destiny. Before that day he had been a Renaissance marvel, athletic, charming, eloquent. Afterward, something in him darkened. His moods swung violently, his body betrayed him, and the ulcers that blossomed on his legs became both symptom and symbol of a monarchy rotting from within. We know this not from rumour alone, but from fragments long hidden, suppressed physicians' notes, ambassadorial dispatches, even the testimony of architecture itself. Doorways widened for his swelling girth, floors reinforced to bear his monstrous bulk. Taken together, they reveal a king whose decline was so grotesque, so politically dangerous, that generations of officials conspired to veil it. This is the story we are about to enter, how England's golden prince became a terror to his own court, how an accident on frozen ground rewrote his very mind, and how his body's slow collapse produced not only stench and fear, but legends that still cling to his memory. It is a tale of medicine without cure, of power maintained through illusion, and of a kingdom forced to bow before the smell of its sovereign's ruin. The walls of Whitehall will not speak of it. The official chronicles prefer silence, but step closer through the corridors heavy with incense, and you will hear it. The muffled sob of a servant fainting at the bedside, the clatter of bowls filled with putrid discharge, the whispered prayers of physicians who knew their patient was beyond saving. This is where our story begins, not with triumph, not with majesty, but with the unspeakable odour of a king unmade. Before we continue, leave a like and subscribe, only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from? Before the stench, before the ulcers, before the throne itself seemed to sag beneath his weight. Henry was everything a Renaissance prince was supposed to be. Born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII, he was not initially expected to rule. That accident of birth gave him in youth a freedom his elder brother Arthur never knew. Where Arthur was groomed for statecraft and burdened with dynastic expectation, young Henry was allowed to cultivate the pursuits of a noble without the crushing crown in view. Those early years shaped him into a figure that dazzled contemporaries. Fluent in Latin, conversant in French, able to debate in Italian and Spanish, Henry embodied the polyglot ideal of the age. Scholars compared him to the humanist princes of Italy. Erasmus himself praised his keen mind and lively presence. But Henry was never only a scholar. He was the athlete of the family, broad-shouldered, red-haired and towering above his peers. Accounts of the young king describe a figure whose vigour seemed inexhaustible. He could ride all day in the hunt, leap fully armoured onto his horse without using the stirrup, and then spend the evening dancing until dawn. He was also a musician and composer. His court heard not only foreign masters, but the king's own creations. Pastime with good company. A song attributed to Henry spread beyond palace walls and became a favourite across England. In those melodies, in the athletic contests, in the hours spent at tilt or chase, the impression was forged. Here was a monarch not only to be obeyed, but to be adored. Foreign ambassadors reporting back to Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire remarked that Henry VIII was the most handsome prince in Christendom. Portraits of this period, now faded, still show a man with fine features, eyes bright with confidence, and a lean strength in his limbs. But alongside the brilliance, there was something else, an instinct for performance. Henry understood that kingship was as much theatre as governance. He loved pageants where he appeared in costume as a knight of Arthurian legend, or a god descending from Olympus. His jousts were not merely sport, but propaganda, each charge down the tilt-yard a living emblem of martial vigour. Court masks filled with allegory showcased him as the sun around which courtiers revolved. Even in youth, when his body required no artifice, Henry displayed a flair for constructing images that magnified his power. This careful curation of presence is worth remembering, for it never left him. When disease would later twist his body into something unrecognisable, he clung to the same instinct. If pageants and armour had once exalted his strength, later paintings and elaborate ceremonies would conceal his weakness. The mask was always part of the man. For now, though, in the first decades of the 16th century, the mask required little deception. Henry seemed to all who beheld him to be the very embodiment of Renaissance monarchy, learned without pedantry, pious without severity, charming without frivolity. Catherine of Aragon. His first queen found herself not merely bound to him by treaty, but swept into the glow of his charisma. England itself basked in the spectacle of vitality. It is this image, the vigorous hunter, the laughing dancer, the king who could strum a lute 1 hour and unhorse a knight the next, that makes what followed so shocking. For the monarch who would end his reign shrouded in foul odours and fear was once a man courtier as compared to Apollo. To understand the tragedy of his fall, one must first see clearly the radiance of the prince he had been. The morning of January 24th, 1536, dawned brittle and bright over Greenwich. Frost laced the tilt-yard, its frozen surface hard as stone, and the breath of horses rose in white clouds against the winter air. The crowd gathered in their hundreds, nobles wrapped in furs, ambassadors craning for a view, commoners pressing for a glimpse of their king in all his martial glory. Tournaments were never mere sport in Tudor England. They were theatre, a stage where Henry VIII proclaimed his vigour and the strength of his dynasty. The king appeared resplendent, clad in custom-forged armour that gleamed like molten silver. Each plate was worth more than a labourer could earn in a lifetime, etched with intricate designs that blurred the line between weapon and jewel. Atop his colossal destrier, a warhorse bred for power, its hooves striking the earth like drums, Henry cut the figure of an invincible knight. He was 44, still broad and commanding, his red gold beard framing a face that radiated confidence. To those assembled he seemed eternal, a monarch untouched by time. The signal was given, lances lowered. 2 armoured titans thundered toward each other, down the frozen track, the ground quaking beneath them. The crowd erupted in cheers, then held its collective breath as the collision came. It should have been another flawless display of controlled violence, another reminder that their king was still the most powerful man in Europe. Instead, fate intervened. The horses collided with the force of a carriage crash. Henry's lance splintered, his balance lost. A heartbeat later, his massive frame, 300 pounds of man and metal, was hurled to the ground. The sound was sickening armour striking ice with a crack that echoed across the tilt-yard. Gasps broke from the spectators, then silence. And then, in a twist as cruel as it was sudden, the king's destrier stumbled. With a terrible inevitability, the warhorse toppled, crashing down directly onto its master. Dust and cries filled the air. Courtiers froze stricken by terror. Was this how England's monarch would die, not in battle or bed, but crushed in sport? Panic rippled through the crowd, but none dared rush forward. To touch the king unbidden was unthinkable. To witness him broken was unbearable. For 2 hours Henry lay motionless, unconscious on the frozen ground. 2 hours in which England had no king, no clear future. 2 hours when ambassadors whispered what foreign powers might do if the throne fell vacant, when councillors weighed the terrifying question of succession, when every heartbeat in the court seemed stretched to breaking. In her chambers nearby, Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant with the male heir she had promised Henry, waited in agony. For her the stakes were merciless. If Henry died, she would be a discarded widow, her unborn child at the mercy of rival factions. If he lived but lost his vitality, her own fragile position might crumble. For 2 hours she prayed, each moment thick with fear, each spasm from the tilt-yard echoing like a funeral bell. Then against expectation Henry stirred. His eyes opened, but witnesses later swore something had changed in them. Where once there had been brilliance and charm, there now flickered a darker flame, volatile, unpredictable. His first words were not gratitude for survival, nor concern for his unborn child, but fury. He demanded to know why the tournament had been stopped, as if the spectacle mattered more than the shattering blow he had endured. The crowd cheered in relief, but beneath the jubilation there was unease. For though England's king had risen from the ground, something unseen had shifted. The fall had not merely bruised flesh and bone, it had jarred the very foundations of his mind, and with it the future of a kingdom. In those 2 hours of silence, England had hovered between life and death, between succession and collapse. And though Henry would rise to rule again, the man who left the tilt-yard that day was not the same as the one who had entered it. A nation had held its breath. It would exhale into an age of fear. The morning of January the 24th, 1536, dawned brittle and bright over Greenwich. Frost laced the tilt-yard, its frozen surface hard as stone, and the breath of horses rose in white clouds against the winter air. The crowd gathered in their hundreds, nobles wrapped in furs, ambassadors craning for a view, commoners pressing for a glimpse of their king in all his martial glory. Tournaments were never mere sport in Tudor England. They were theatre, a stage where Henry VIII proclaimed his vigour and the strength of his dynasty. The king appeared resplendent, clad in custom-forged armour that gleamed like molten silver. Each plate was worth more than a labourer could earn in a lifetime, etched with intricate designs that blurred the line between weapon and jewel. Atop his colossal destrier, a warhorse bred for power, its hooves striking the earth like drums. Henry cut the figure of an invincible knight. He was 44, still broad and commanding, his red-gold beard framing a face that radiated confidence. To those assembled he seemed eternal, a monarch, untouched by time. The signal was given, lances lowered. 2 armoured titans thundered toward each other, down the frozen track, the ground quaking beneath them. The crowd erupted in cheers, then held its collective breath as the collision came. It should have been another flawless display of controlled violence, another reminder that their king was still the most powerful man in Europe. Instead, fate intervened. The horses collided with the force of a carriage crash. Henry's lance splintered, his balance lost. A heartbeat later, his massive frame, 300 pounds of man and metal, was hurled to the ground. The sound was sickening armour striking ice with a crack that echoed across the tilt-yard. Gasps broke from the spectators, then silence. And then, in a twist as cruel as it was sudden, the king's destrier stumbled. With a terrible inevitability, the warhorse toppled, crashing down directly onto its master. Dust and cries filled the air. Courtiers froze stricken by terror. Was this how England's monarch would die, not in battle or bed, but crushed in sport? Panic rippled through the crowd, but none dared rush forward. To touch the king unbidden was unthinkable. To witness him broken was unbearable. For 2 hours Henry lay motionless, unconscious, on the frozen ground. 2 hours in which England had no king, no clear future. 2 hours when ambassadors whispered what foreign powers might do if the throne fell vacant, when councillors weighed the terrifying question of succession, when every heartbeat in the court seemed stretched to breaking. In her chambers nearby, Anne Boleyn, heavily pregnant with the male heir she had promised Henry, waited in agony. For her the stakes were merciless. If Henry died, she would be a discarded widow, her unborn child at the mercy of rival factions. If he lived but lost his vitality, her own fragile position might crumble. For 2 hours she prayed, each moment thick with fear, each silence from the tilt-yard echoing like a funeral bell. Then against expectation Henry stirred. His eyes opened, but witnesses later swore something had changed in them. Where once there had been brilliance and charm, there now flickered a darker flame, volatile, unpredictable. His first words were not gratitude for survival, nor concern for his unborn child, but fury. He demanded to know why the tournament had been stopped, as if the spectacle mattered more than the shattering blow he had endured. The crowd cheered in relief, but beneath the jubilation there was unease, for though England's king had risen from the ground, something unseen had shifted. The fall had not merely bruised flesh and bone, it had jarred the very foundations of his mind, and with it the future of a kingdom. In those 2 hours of silence, England had hovered between life and death, between succession and collapse. And though Henry would rise to rule again, the man who left the tilt-yard that day was not the same as the one who had entered it. A nation had held its breath. It would exhale into an age of fear. The pageantry of Greenwich ended with a crash, but the deeper impact was invisible. Modern neuroscience gives us the language that Tudor physicians lacked: a traumatic brain injury likely to the frontal lobe, the seat of judgment, personality and impulse control. To his contemporaries, the change seemed like a dark enchantment. One day, England's king was the dazzling Renaissance prince, magnanimous, witty, generous in spirit. The next, he was volatile, suspicious and cruel. The record of Henry before 1536 shows a ruler remarkable for his restraint, at least by the brutal standards of his age. For over 20 years he remained married to Catherine of Aragon, despite her failure to produce a surviving male heir. Unlike earlier kings, he executed relatively few nobles in his early reign, preferring negotiation and show trials to mass bloodshed. He cultivated harmony at court, presided over tournaments with grace, and was known for sudden gestures of mercy that astonished foreign observers. After the tilt-yard fall, restraint gave way to violence. It is no coincidence that only months later Anne Boleyn, the queen who had risked everything to marry him, was dragged to the scaffold. Within the same year, Thomas More's successor in reform, Thomas Cromwell, once the king's trusted architect of policy, would lose his head. Friends became traitors overnight. Wives became enemies with the turn of a mood. The executions mounted with terrifying speed. Witnesses noticed more than cruelty, they noticed unpredictability. Servants reported finding Henry weeping uncontrollably one moment, then erupting into blind rage the next. He would laugh with a gesture only to order the man whipped or dismissed minutes later. Ambassadors complained that negotiations dissolved into incoherence, the king shifting from charming host to belligerent tyrant without warning. The court lived in a state of constant vigilance, reading his eyes and tone as one might read storm clouds before a deluge. The injury to his head may also explain what puzzled contemporaries most: the collapse of his once extraordinary self-control. The young Henry had mastered debate with Europe's finest theologians, carefully weighing words, always keeping anger in check. Post-1536, Henry erupted into tirades at the smallest slight. He became obsessed with betrayal, convinced that poisoners lurked in his kitchens and that conspiracies thrived in his bedchamber. Even his most loyal servants began to fear being mistaken for enemies. The two Henrys haunted Whitehall. Courtiers whispered of the prince who had once composed music and poetry, and of the new tyrant whose paranoia stained every hall. Some still tried to coax glimpses of the old king through masks, through music, through the company of old friends, but these moments were fleeting. The darkness returned heavier each time. For England, the consequences were seismic. Where once law and governance had been balanced by the monarch's measured temperament, now whim ruled. Policies reversed, overnight alliances shattered, families destroyed. The royal will became not only absolute but unstable. In the corridors of power, emotional football whiplash was a daily hazard. Ministers might be embraced in the morning and condemned to death by nightfall. To his subjects, the change was terrifying but unexplainable. To us, it bears the clear signature of a fractured crown, not in regalia, but in the brain itself. A man whose mind had once been a fortress of discipline now lived with its gates broken, his impulses charging unchecked into the realm he commanded. The jousting yard had delivered not just an injury to flesh, but a permanent wound to the kingdom's governance. England would pay for it in fear and blood. The crash at Greenwich did more than bruise Henry's skull. It tore open a scar the king had carried for years, and from that wound seeped the true horror of his decline. Long before 1536, Henry had suffered a leg injury, likely from an earlier jousting mishap that had healed awkwardly. It left behind only a scar, an old soldier's mark, something he could display almost with pride. But the fall that winter split the scar wide again, transforming it from a badge of vigour into a gateway for decay. Tudor medicine had few weapons against such a wound. The very notion of infection as we understand it was centuries away. Physicians spoke instead of corrupt humours or venom that festered beneath the skin. Treatments were brutal improvisations, lancing cauterization with hot irons, poultices of herbs or honey pressed into raw flesh. None of it could halt the relentless spread of bacteria. In modern terms, Henry developed chronic osteomyelitis, an infection that burrows into bone and poisons the bloodstream day after day. To his courtiers, it was simpler. They smelled rot and knew it foretold death. The ulcer on his leg became his constant companion, a hidden tyrant ruling his days. At first, it was no more than a sore that refused to close. Soon it swelled the skin around it, angry and inflamed pus oozing whenever pressure was applied. The pain was ceaseless, a dull throb that sharpened with every movement. Imagine the agony of even silk bedclothes brushing against open flesh, or the torment of armor straps digging into a wound that never healed. Each step was a reminder that his body, once a symbol of unbreakable strength, had betrayed him. The court had no vocabulary fit to name it. To speak of the king's rotting flesh was treasonous. Instead, they whispered of the malady of his legs, a phrase that concealed as much as it revealed. Servants carried away bowls filled with foul-smelling discharge and said nothing. Physicians recorded their notes in guarded language describing ulcers most grievous and ill-favoured, rather than admitting they were staring at decomposition in the living. What could not be spoken had to be endured by the king in agony and by those forced to attend him in silence. And yet Henry in his vanity would not yield to weakness. He pressed the wound into silence with bandages, devised special garters to compress it, and ordered ever more costly perfumes to mask the stench. But the body will not be deceived. The crash of 1536 had reopened the door, and infection had stepped through. From that moment on, rot walked with the king. It would not leave him, and though courtiers could not name it aloud, they smelled it in every hall he entered. Behind the velvet hangings of Whitehall, the king's day began not with ceremony but with surgery. Servants carried in bronze bowls and linens already resigned to the work ahead. Henry's leg ulcers had to be drained sometimes, once, often twice a day. Physicians would pierce the swollen flesh, releasing gushes of thick, foul-smelling pus that filled the air with a stench so sharp it made even hardened attendants gag. The bowls heavy with infected fluid were hurried away by pages who learned to hold their breath as they passed through the corridors. To speak of it was forbidden. To smell it was unavoidable. Dr. Thomas, Vicary, Sergeant Surgeon to the king, left behind careful but coded notes. He described ulcers of grievous nature stinking and painful beyond measure. These were not the wounds of a soldier who had been careless in battle. They were the festering consequence of a monarch's vanity, a man who insisted on armour and jousts long past the age when his body could endure them. Vicary, bound by loyalty as well as fear, could only record, never cure. Beside him was Dr. Thomas Wendy, physician, to the king, whose later writings, discovered centuries after Henry's death, testify to the near impossible task of keeping sovereign dignity intact when the royal body itself had become corrupted. Between Vicary's lancets and Wendy's ointments of honey resin and oil of roses, there was no victory to be had, only a delaying of the inevitable. Henry, desperate to conceal what he could not conquer, turned to artifice. He designed special garters reinforced with lead weights to compress the ulcers, believing pressure would force them to close. In reality, the contraption strangled circulation, deepening the infection and inflaming the pain. He drenched his body in perfumes ambergris from Wales musk from the East Rose oil imported at great cost. Yet the odours clung to him like shadows. Courtiers described a scent at once floral and putrid, though decay itself had been dressed in silks. In the sick room the truth could not be hidden. Servants fainted at their tasks. Physicians muttered prayers under their breath as they probed wounds that would never heal. But beyond those guarded doors, the public mask was maintained. Henry appeared in his famous wide-legged stance, power radiating from every brushstroke of Holbein's portraits. He processed through halls in garments embroidered with gold, his figure designed to awe, not to repel. He was England's lion, not England's invalid. This duality, the private horror of pus and the public pageantry of perfume, defined the last decade of his reign. To his body, Henry was a prisoner of rot. To his people, he was still the king who had broken Rome and bent nobles to his will. The courtiers who carried away bowls of infection were the same who applauded his appearances in silk and ermine. The mask and the wound existed together, each feeding the other, until the illusion was almost as poisonous as the ulcers themselves. When words failed, paint could still lie. In the last decade of Henry's reign, the body that staggered through Whitehall was increasingly absent from the images that circulated across Europe. Instead, the king's likeness was curated with ruthless precision, none more famously than in the hands of Hans Holbein the Younger. The Whitehall mural, destroyed by fire, but preserved in copies, did not simply depict a monarch. It choreographed an illusion of power. There he stands, legs spread in that unmistakable stance, hips wide, feet planted firmly as if he anchors the kingdom itself. The pose is theatrical in reality. Henry's ulcers made it agonizing to stand unaided. His legs, swollen and bandaged beneath layers of silk hose, would never have supported such balance without props or attendants. But in pigment he towers. The codpiece juts forward like a weapon. an unsubtle declaration of virility from a man whose body was failing him. His hands resting on hips convey dominance. His gaze confronts the viewer with unflinching authority. Nothing in that portrait speaks of illness or weakness. This was not spontaneous artistry, it was statecraft. Holbein in his workshop understood the stakes. Drafts and underdrawings reveal alterations, limbs, adjusted shoulders, broadened features, sharpened into symmetrical majesty. Assistants laid down layers of paint to amplify presence, while overpainting erased signs of frailty. Even after Henry's death, details were deliberately modified, removing unsettling symbols, straightening lines that betrayed tremor. The king's body became not a subject, but a canvas upon which stability itself was painted. Beyond portraits, costume performed the same deception. Henry's wardrobe was engineered to project vigour. Massive sleeves swelled with padding cloaks embroidered with gold caught the light and distracted the eye. Tailors cut garments to exaggerate breadth at the shoulders and conceal swelling at the waist and legs. Jewels and chains gleamed not only as treasure, but as armour, pulling attention upward away from the hidden sores. Ceremony too was choreographed. Ritual entrances were planned along routes where sightlines could be managed. Courtiers were instructed to keep their distance, so that the king's halting gait was less noticeable. At times, Henry was moved in a wheeled chair, carefully positioned so that he seemed enthroned rather than transported. When he processed through great halls, supports were hidden behind a drapery or disguised as servants' hands adjusting robes. Every appearance was a stage-managed production, the monarchy itself depending on the illusion that its centre was unshaken. Holbein's famous image, then, is not just art, it is propaganda layered over infirmity. The king who stared down his subjects from the wall was not the Henry of 1546 sweating and reeking in his chamber, but a constructed colossus. This choreography of body and image allowed a rotting sovereign to continue projecting dominance. To his enemies abroad, the stance declared invincibility. To his subjects at home, it demanded obedience. Few dared remember that the legs beneath the codpiece were wrapped in bandages soaked with pus. In this way, portraiture became as essential as medicine. The surgeon drained, the physician prayed, but it was the painter who preserved the monarchy's facade, and for centuries it worked. When we imagine Henry VIII today, it is not the bloated invalid we see, but Holbein's crafted giant, a performance of power that outlived the man who inspired it. By the early 1540s, the strain of Henry's body was no longer borne by flesh alone, it was absorbed into the very walls of his palaces. The man who had once leapt into the saddle without stirrup was now a weight that warped wood-bent furniture and demanded engineering solutions just to keep appearances intact. His body had become an architecture of burden, and architecture itself bent to accommodate him. Armour tells the first story. Surviving suits in the Tower of London record the expansion of his waistline more vividly than any chronicle. In 1540, Henry's armour measures a formidable 48 inches at the waist. Only 5 years later, a new set required 54 a circumference, larger than many modern refrigerators. These iron shells were less the outfits of a knight than the exoskeletons of a king growing too vast for his own legend. Once instruments of display and combat, the armours had become silent witnesses to a body spiralling out of proportion. Palaces too bore the marks of this transformation. At Hampton Court, doorways were widened to accommodate Henry's bulk, their frames scarred with the chisels of carpenters who dared not complain. Floors were reinforced with extra beams after the king's weight threatened to crack the timbers beneath his chambers. Every procession, once a display of effortless grandeur, now required calculation which hallways could bear him, which stairs must be avoided, which chambers needed modification to prevent humiliation. His bedchamber became a workshop of contrivance. Pulley systems were installed above his bed ropes and harnesses hidden behind rich hangings to help lift him upright each morning. It took teams of strong servants to maneuver him from mattress to chair, their labour disguised beneath the rituals of dressing. Special chairs were built with arms that could be removed, allowing attendants to wedge his vast body into place. Thrones once symbols of dominion were reconstructed as supports against collapse. Even his movement through the palace was a choreography of concealment. When he could not walk, a wheeled chair carried him, but its appearance was carefully managed. Attendants arranged his robes so that he seemed enthroned rather than transported. Visitors glimpsed only the magnificence of the ermine and jewels, never the groaning mechanisms or strained backs that bore him forward. In this way, the palace itself became a prosthetic, an exoskeleton of timber and stone constructed to hold up the king who could no longer hold himself. Architecture became complicit in the illusion, reinforcing not just beams, but the myth of vitality. The courtiers who widened doorways and strengthened floors were not merely carpenters. They were custodians of sovereignty, preserving the fiction that their ruler still embodied the strength carved into Holbein's portraits. Yet every beam, every pulley, every secret adaptation whispered the same truth: England's most powerful man was collapsing inward, and only the fabric of his palaces kept him upright. The body that had once embodied the Renaissance ideal had become a burden heavy enough to bend oak and crack stone. And still the kingdom bowed before him, never daring to ask how much longer wood and will could bear the weight of a king. The ulcers on Henry's legs were not just local wounds, they were open gates through which poison entered his bloodstream every day. Modern physicians would recognize the condition as chronic osteomyelitis, a deep infection of the bone that releases bacteria and toxins into the body in a relentless trickle. In Henry's case, it was less a trickle than a tide. What began as soreness after his jousting fall became an unending source of systemic poison seeping into every organ, every thought. The body under such siege responds with inflammation, a defense that soon turns destructive. Fevers came and went unpredictably, drenching the king in sweat one night and leaving him shivering with teeth chattering the next. The infection gnawed at his marrow, releasing compounds that attacked nerves and clouded the mind. The pain was constant, but it shifted in character at times, a throbbing ache that dulled his every movement at others, a searing neuropathic fire that felt as though his legs themselves were aflame. Worse still were the effects on the brain. Toxins do not respect boundaries. Once they crossed into Henry's nervous system, they produced violent mood swings, fury and despair, paranoia and elation seemingly without cause. 1 hour he could be jovial, feasting and laughing. The next he might erupt into suspicion, convinced his food was poisoned, or his courtiers as plotting treason. To the men and women around him it seemed less like medicine than possession. The king, who had once been steady as oak, now shifted like a storm-tossed sea, and the entire kingdom was forced to sail on his swells. This was not metaphorical. Policy itself bent to the rhythms of his symptoms. When fever burned, he retreated into isolation, leaving ministers to stall foreign envoys. When pain flared, executions followed, scapegoats sacrificed to distract the sovereign from his torment. When fleeting relief came, treaties might be signed, or a favourite showered with gifts only for the mood to collapse again days later. The governance of England was no longer rational strategy, but the reflection of one man's poisoned bloodstream. Contemporaries sensed the strangeness but lacked the language. They spoke of a king haunted by demons of God's wrath made visible in festering sores. What they were witnessing was the chemistry of infection dictating the fate of a nation. Behind proclamations and policy, behind scaffolds and banquets, lay the steady drip of toxins that transformed Henry's body into a battlefield and his kingdom to collateral damage. In truth, England in the 1540s was governed by more than council or crown. It was ruled by inflammatory cascades, by fevers that stole the king's reason, by pain that drove him to cruelty. Every swing of his mood carried the weight of law. Every surge of his bloodstream echoed in the lives of subjects far beyond Whitehall. The body of the king had always been political. Now poisoned from within, it became the most dangerous policy engine of all. By the mid-1540s, Henry's court was less a palace than a theatre of fear. Every ritual, every gesture, every silence had to be calibrated against the volatility of a sovereign whose moods could ignite without warning. The corridors, once filled with music and revelry, now throbbed with the low hum of dread. Courtiers learned to live as if they were walking across thin ice. Each step measured, each word weighed. The king's meals became ceremonies of suspicion. Food tasters sampled every dish, not only for poison, but for texture and smell, lest Henry's imagination detect treachery. Even his medicines were not exempt. Servants were sometimes forced to smear ointments on their own skin before the royal body would accept treatment, as though danger might seep from balm to blood. The bandages taken from his legs, soaked in pus and stench, were carried to him for inspection. He would sniff them, his face twisted with distrust before permitting them to be burned. Accidents at court, once mere mishaps, became matters of life and death. A servant who sneezed near the king's meal could be hauled away for interrogation. A lady whose hem brushed his robe might find her family's estates confiscated. The simplest mistake could be reframed as conspiracy, because in Henry's mind the line between clumsiness and treason had dissolved. To survive, courtiers developed codes of self-preservation. Pages stationed outside the privy chamber were said to carry ribbons in discrete colours, white for calm, black for melancholy, red for rage. A flick of fabric through a doorway signalled to those within how the king must be approached, or whether they should vanish altogether. Diplomats wrote of audiences delayed or cancelled on pretext, while insiders knew the truth: the king was in a mood no treaty could penetrate. The rhythm of power mirrored the rhythm of Henry's poisoned body. When the pain surged, so did executions. Anne Boleyn's fall and Cromwell's downfall, Catherine Howard's death, all unfolded in the years after his accident, when suspicion hardened into law. Annulments multiplied, as if marriage vows could dissolve Henry's torment. Memory itself betrayed him. One day he spoke tenderly of old companions, the next he raged that those same men were plotting against him even if they were long dead. Fear soaked into the tapestries and woodwork of Whitehall, a presence as palpable as the smell of decay. Courtiers no longer saw the king as the radiant centre of a Renaissance court, but as the storm at its heart, unpredictable and lethal. The careful choreography of masks and tournaments was gone. In its place was a ritual of survival where the wrong glance or the wrong word might summon the scaffold. Paranoia had taken the throne and England bent beneath it. Ministers schemed less to shape policy than to read moods, less to advise than to endure. The monarchy had become the mind of one man, and that mind, poisoned and fractured, was devouring itself. When Henry rose from the tilt-yard in 1536, he did not merely carry bruises and a reopened wound. He carried a new merciless volatility that fell hardest on the women bound to him. His marriages, once instruments of dynastic ambition, became arenas where paranoia, physical decline, and the desperate hunger for a son collided. Intimacy was never private for a king, but after the accident it hardened into a political stereotype, each queen playing her part under the shadow of dread. Anne Boleyn felt it first. She had risked everything, her reputation, her family's standing, even England's place in Christendom, to become Henry's queen. In her, he had once seen a fire bright enough to justify breaking with Rome. But after the accident, as his moods darkened, and his body soured with pain, Anne's sharp wit and restless spirit turned from delight to irritation. She miscarried a son in January 1536, only days after the fall, a loss that sealed her fate. Within months, Henry's suspicion hardened into accusation. Adultery, incest, witchcraft, the charges were grotesque fictions, but they satisfied a king who could no longer tolerate uncertainty. In May, the woman for whom he had remade a kingdom was beheaded on Tower Green. Jane Seymour followed almost immediately, a salve to Henry's wounded pride. Gentle, compliant, and above all fertile, she seemed the antidote to Anne's sharpness. When she delivered Edward in 1537, Henry exulted as though his pain had been forgotten. At last, a legitimate male heir, the proof his body still had potency. Yet Jane's triumph was brief. She died of puerperal fever less than 2 weeks later, leaving Henry with a son, but also a void. In the fevered whispers of the court, some said God had granted him an heir, only to punish him with grief. To Henry the message was simpler. Joy could not be trusted. By the 1540s, his body betrayed him more visibly. Swollen with weight, crippled by ulcers, he turned to Catherine Howard, a girl barely 17 when she entered his bed. The contrast was grotesque. She was youthful, giggling, sometimes tipsy with wine to dull the revulsion she felt at his advances. He was 50, bloated, reeking of infection, requiring servants to lift him onto his horse. Yet he adored her, calling her his rose without a thorn. Courtiers watched with unease as the king, decaying before their eyes, paraded a teenager at his side. The marriage predictably ended in catastrophe. When rumours of Catherine's flirtations surfaced, Henry's adoration flipped to murderous rage. In 1542, she too was led to the block, her head falling before she had even reached 20. The king's body had failed him. Now in his paranoia he turned his queens into scapegoats. Marriage for Henry had once been about alliance and legacy. After 1536, it became theatre rituals of distraction from his pain, desperate gambits for stability, or grotesque displays of dominance. Queens became symbols: Anne the traitor, Jane the sainted mother, Catherine the faithless child. Each was consumed by a monarch whose personal torment fused with politics until intimacy itself became another instrument of tyranny. In those unions, England could see the truth no painter dared to depict. The body of the king was failing, and with it the women closest to him were offered up one by one to feed the illusion of control. By the mid-1540s, the sickness in Henry's legs had seeped into his mind. Court whispers told of a sovereign who no longer ruled alone in his chambers, but in the company of ghosts. Ambassadors' letters dispatched across Europe describe scenes that were at once pitiable and terrifying. England's king breaking into argument with an empty chair or gesturing furiously at shadows only he could see. To outsiders it looked like madness. To courtiers it was a daily hazard that had to be choreographed into silence. Reports agree on the nature of these apparitions. Henry often spoke to his dead father Henry VII, defending his expenditures, promising that the fortunes painfully amassed in the new Tudor dynasty were not squandered. At other times he called out to his mother Elizabeth of York, the gentle queen who had died when he was a boy of 11. Her absence had haunted his youth. Now, in fevered visions, he begged her for protection, as though he were still a child. More disturbing were his confrontations with those he himself had condemned. At banquets, he was said to fall silent mid-sentence, his face draining of colour, then erupt into rages against invisible presences. The French ambassador reported a chilling scene. Henry propped painfully in his substitute chair, suddenly turned to an empty place at table and screamed at Anne Boleyn's ghost to stop mocking him. He declared he would take her head again if she dared defy him. Courtiers froze in horror, then quickly resumed eating once the king's fury ebbed, as though nothing had happened. These were not isolated incidents. Council meetings were derailed when Henry's memories tangled with reality. Discussion of taxation might dissolve into bitter recollections of betrayals long past delivered to men who had been dead for years. Documents bear marginal notes in the king's own hand scrawled accusations against advisers executed a decade earlier. The line between past and present had collapsed, and policy itself became entangled with the voices only Henry could hear. The court responded with choreography. Pages stationed near the king learned to divert attention when his gaze fixed on empty air, presenting petitions, shifting the conversation, drawing his attention to ritual. Musicians were summoned to fill silences when his mutterings grew too loud. Ambassadors were carefully managed. If the king's mind seemed clear, they were ushered in. If not, excuses of illness or fatigue postponed their audiences. The machinery of monarchy bent itself around the unpredictability of a mind no longer wholly in the present. Yet in public the mask had to be preserved. Chroniclers did not record the ghosts. Official proclamations spoke only of the king's strength and wisdom. To admit that Henry conversed with the dead was to admit that England's authority itself was fraying, and so courtiers learned to play their parts, to nod solemnly when he spoke to shadows, to feign ignorance when his temper lashed out at air, to protect the fiction that the king's will was still coherent, still divine. Behind that silence, though, lingered a deeper fear. If Henry could not tell the living from the dead, how could England distinguish between justice and vengeance, between governance and hallucination? For a decade, policy bore the fingerprints of ghosts, and a nation obeyed laws written by a man haunted at his own table. The year 1542 marked a dreadful pivot in Henry's decline. For 6 years his ulcers had been ghastly but survivable, draining pus daily, yet leaving him capable of ruling, of hunting, when carried to horse, of showing himself in public with sufficient disguise. But in that year something changed. Dr. Thomas Vickery's notes cautiously phrased in Latin record a shift in the nature of the wound. The discharge, once pale yellow, thick and foul enough, now darkened first green, then a putrid brown. The smell, already oppressive, took on a new sharpness that contemporaries compared to carrion left too long in the sun. It was no longer the odour of sickness. It was the smell of death. This change signalled what modern physicians would recognise as a turning point: necrosis, spreading infection, deepening into bone and tissue, releasing toxins into the bloodstream at a pace his body could not withstand. The fever that had once come and gone began to settle in his frame, a permanent companion. His nights grew restless, soaked in sweat, his mornings sluggish with exhaustion. The skin around his legs swelled and blackened, forcing attendants to lance deeper, releasing fluids that no perfume could disguise. Yet the kingdom could not pause for its monarch's rot. Administrative burdens pressed harder than ever. The wars with Scotland demanded funding and strategy. Alliances on the continent shifted like sand. The delicate question of succession haunted every council, and through it all ministers had to balance obedience with survival. To oppose the king was to risk death. To agree too eagerly with his fevered rages was to court suspicion. They learned to tread a knife's edge, framing advice so that Henry believed it was his own idea, steering him without seeming to steer. It was a dangerous dance, for his moods had grown mercurial. Pain fed rage, fever fed paranoia. One day he might approve a tax levy, the next he would cancel it with fury, convinced his council sought to rob him. A noble praised in the morning might be accused of treason by nightfall. Councillors whispered to each other in guarded tones, never knowing which of them might be next. The scaffold loomed constantly, its shadow stretching across the privy chamber, as surely as across Tower Hill. Still the machinery of monarchy kept moving. Orders were drafted, seals applied, ambassadors received in gilded halls heavy with incense. Foreign envoys wrote admiringly of Henry's grandeur, never noting that beneath the embroidered hose his legs were swaddled in bandages, dripping corruption into secret bowls. England's face to the world remained steady even as its motor seized the great ship of state, propelled by momentum long after its captain had lost control of the wheel. 1542 was the year the mask began to slip. Courtiers noticed the difference in the king's scent, the change in his gait, the sluggishness of his mind. Ministers began to shoulder more of the real burden of rule, improvising to keep the kingdom from drifting into chaos, but no one dared speak aloud the truth. They all knew. The king himself was collapsing piece by piece, undone, not by war or conspiracy, but by his own decaying flesh. By the winter of 1544, Henry's decline had become impossible to ignore, yet it was precisely then that the machinery of concealment reached its height. What the king lost in health, his court replaced with choreography. Every movement, every appearance was now an illusion as carefully staged as a mask. The body itself was unravelling. Sleep deserted him. He spent nights thrashing in fever sheets soaked through before dawn attendants forced to change them in silence. When he did drift into rest, it was shallow and punctured by nightmares, visions of flames, of accusing faces of the dead who whispered his name. Appetite fluctuated wildly. One day he gorged on capons and sugared fruits the next. He refused food altogether, nauseated by the stench rising from his own body. Circulation faltered, his legs ballooned with edema, the skin stretched taut and shiny, splitting under pressure to ooze clear fluid. His face swelled until his once celebrated features sagged into distorted pouches of yellowed flesh. Courtiers whispered of jaundice, though they never dared use the word aloud. Infections bloomed in places that would not heal. Small cuts on his hands or scratches on his arms festered red and angry because his body no longer had strength to resist. Physicians applied honey vinegar, ground pearls, even powdered gold leaf in desperate attempts to coax recovery. Nothing worked. The ulcers on his legs remained the central battlefield, but they were no longer the only front. Every wound was now an open door, and disease marched through at will. And yet when Henry appeared in public, the spectacle remained dazzling. Vestments grew heavier, layered not only for majesty but for concealment. Ermine-lined cloaks and stiff brocades disguised swelling. Wide sleeves covered trembling hands. Portraits painted during these years still present him as towering and immovable, a colossus in cloth of gold, even as his body beneath sagged and seeped. Processions became feats of stage management. Routes were carefully chosen so that the king could appear seated in splendour, avoiding stairs or narrow corridors. Platforms were built so that his chair could be wheeled in without being recognised as such, the audience seeing only a monarch enthroned. Courtiers flanked him at calculated distances, their spacing disguising his halting gait, or more often obscuring the fact that he was scarcely walking at all. Viewing angles were engineered with precision. Audiences were arranged so that subjects looked upward at the king, never close enough to see the swelling in his legs or the sweat on his brow. When ambassadors were received, incense smouldered in braziers, perfumes were poured liberally, and windows were flung open to thin the air, all to mute the odour that clung to him. The result was a spectacle of power carefully balanced on silence. Those who glimpsed him across a hall still saw majesty, the broad frame, the wide stance, the glittering robes. They did not see the ropes and pulleys in his chamber, the reinforced floors, the servants struggling to lift him. They did not hear the groans that accompanied each attempt to rise, or the hiss of pain when a bandage pressed too hard. In these last winters, Henry's reign became a theatre of concealment. The king himself was less an actor than the role he played, his body failing, but his image preserved by the collective effort of a court too fearful to admit the truth. The sovereign England worshipped was already a phantom conjured from fabric, incense and paint. The real man, buried beneath layers of cloth and ceremony, was rotting by inches. January of 1547 was the month when Henry's body, long embattled, finally surrendered piece by piece. What had begun as a wound had become a system-wide collapse. To read the accounts left by physicians and attendants is to glimpse a man dissolving into fragments of pain. Modern medicine would call it multiple organ failure. To his contemporaries, it was simply the hand of God closing on the crown. The kidneys, forced for years to filter a bloodstream thick with infection, faltered. Urine darkened to the colour of old ale, sharp with the smell of ammonia. Fluid pooled in his abdomen, swelling his girth until even his reinforced chairs creaked under the strain. His liver, bloated and diseased, betrayed him. Two, skin-yellowed, eyes jaundiced, appetite gone sour. Edema spread to his limbs, legs bursting with water. Retention, so severe the skin split in places, weeping fluid that soaked through layers of linen. Breath itself became labour. In the last nights, attendants reported the sound physicians today call the death rattle, a wet gurgling rasp as his lungs filled with fluid. Each inhale seemed a drowning, each exhale a surrender. His tongue, swollen grotesquely, made his speech thick and incomprehensible, though his courtiers leaned close to decipher words that veered between command and delirium. Lucidity flickered like a candle in a storm. One moment he begged his physicians to save him, promising riches beyond measure. The next he cursed them, threatening tortures they knew he no longer had the strength to order. At times he wept, calling for his mother or for Catherine of Aragon, as though time itself had collapsed, and all the betrayals and loves of his life crowded around his bed. Then in sudden clarity he would demand state papers, scrawling half-legible signatures, as if the machinery of government could outpace his failing heart. On January the 27th, the final storm gathered. Henry suffered what modern observers would recognise as a massive stroke. One side of his face drooped, his words dissolved into slurred groans, and his body sagged into paralysis. Attendants propped him against pillows, terrified by the sight of their colossus, diminished to helpless flesh. That night, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was summoned. Cranmer, reformer and survivor, found a chamber, thick with incense but unable to mask the stench of decay. The king's body heaved in convulsions, 6 men struggling to hold him down as seizures racked him. Between spasms, Henry clutched the archbishop's hand. Protestant doctrine forbade elaborate rites. Instead, Cranmer asked him to give a sign if he trusted in Christ for salvation. With the last strength in him, Henry squeezed once faintly. Then the grip slackened. The king who had torn England from Rome, who had executed queens and dissolved monasteries, who had once danced, jousted and composed songs, now lay silent. At dawn on January 28, 1547, the ship that had once been England's mightiest vessel creaked, splintered and sank into stillness. The giant was gone, leaving only the stench of a storm finally spent. Henry's final breath was not announced with trumpets. Instead, his death was treated as a state secret, a fact so volatile that it was smothered under silence for 3 long days. The most powerful man in England had died, but the realm could not be allowed to know it, not yet. Too much was at stake: the succession of young Prince Edward, the ambitions of rival factions, the manoeuvres of foreign powers waiting for weakness. And behind politics lurked a more immediate crisis: the corpse itself. For Henry's body was not the body of a healthy man. It was a swollen, infected mass already decomposing before life had left it. Within hours, gases began to build, swelling his vast frame further. The stench, overwhelming even in life, thickened, until servants fainted while changing his bedclothes. Doors were thrown open in the dead of January to vent the chamber's braziers of incense, smoked endlessly, and yet the odour seeped through every corridor. The embalmers were summoned in haste. Their task was nearly impossible. When they opened the royal body, they discovered organs so diseased they crumbled at the touch. The liver collapsed into fragments. The intestines, blackened and slick with gangrene, exuded a smell so unbearable that one assistant reportedly vomited and fled. Yet the work had to be done. They packed the cavities with coarse salt spices and herbs, rosemary, lavender, juniper, to draw out moisture and veil the corruption. Waxed cloths soaked in turpentine were layered over the body, each one sealing the decay as best it could. Finally, the entire form was encased in a massive lead coffin so heavy that special reinforcements had to be ordered. Even this was not security enough. Gases hissed within, threatening to warp the metal itself. Meanwhile, the council moved with equal urgency to contain the political fallout. The fiction of the king's life had to be maintained until succession was secured. Messengers told foreign envoys that Henry was indisposed, resting under the care of physicians. Courtiers continued to speak of him in the present tense. Guards patrolled the palace with solemn routine as though nothing had changed. Behind closed doors, however, the future was being decided. Edward Seymour and his allies plotted their grip on the regency, weighing allies and enemies writing orders that would bear a dead king's name. Logistics buckled under the strain of both body and politics. The lead coffin, when sealed, weighed nearly half a ton. Moving it through the palace required reinforced carriages, widened doors, and teams of straining horses. The rituals of death lying in state procession burial had to be rewritten to accommodate both the physical reality of the corpse and the desperate need to control the story. For 3 days, England lived in a strange limbo. Its king was dead yet officially alive. His body rotted even as his signature continued to authorize decrees. Silence was not mourning but necessity. Only when preparations were complete, only when the council held firm control did the secret break. By then, the king who had terrorized and reshaped a nation was beyond recognition, sealed in lead, and herbs already more symbol than man. The journey from Whitehall to Windsor was meant to be solemn, magnificent a procession that declared continuity even in death. Instead, it became a grim performance of concealment shadowed by the grotesque reality inside the coffin. Henry's body, swaddled in salts, herbs, and turpentine, had been sealed in a lead casket so massive that it weighed nearly half a ton. A special carriage was built to bear it, its axles reinforced its frame, strengthened with iron bands. Even so, the burden strained the team of 8 great horses tasked with pulling it. The January roads were slick with rain mud, sucking at the wheels, turning every mile into a trial of strength. Progress that should have taken a day stretched into 3. At each halt, men gathered in silence around the carriage, listening uneasily to the sounds that came from within. For though the coffin was sealed, it was not quiet. Witnesses spoke of pops and groans as if the lid itself were breathing. Gas from the corrupted body continued to build, warping the casket's sides. Now and then a faint hiss escaped, the sound of pressure straining against containment. Courtiers pretended not to hear, their faces fixed in the mask of composure demanded by ritual. To acknowledge the noise was to admit what everyone already feared, that the king's corruption could not be contained by metal alone. The lying in state had already tested their resolve. Draped in black cloth, the coffin sat beneath canopies of velvet candles guttering in the winter air, incense burning in great censers to drown the smell. Yet those who stood close enough swore the odour still seeped through, clinging to their garments long after they left. Priests chanted prayers, guards stood stiff at their posts, courtiers whispered of miracles to come. All the while, the reality was that the king's body was betraying the performance, reminding all present that rot cannot be sanctified by pageantry. Still the facade held. As the coffin inched its way toward Windsor, the people along the route saw not the swollen corpse, but the trappings of majesty. They saw black horses adorned in mourning cloth banners of royal arms flapping in the wind, heralds riding ahead to proclaim the solemnity of the occasion. They did not see the strain in the horses' flanks, the nervous glances of the attendants or the servants discreetly scattering herbs along the roadside to veil the smell that leaked from the lead. The courtiers choreographed every detail, desperate to keep the public face intact. They moved with the precision of actors' voices, low expressions grave even as their stomachs churned with fear of scandal. A dynasty's image hung on their silence, on their ability to keep composure, while the coffin itself betrayed them with hisses and bulges. It was a procession of shadow, majestic to the eye, grotesque to the ear and nose. And as it crawled through the mud toward Windsor, it carried not only the corpse of a king, but the weight of a secret too foul to ever be spoken aloud. The second night of the procession brought the cortege to Sion Abbey, one of the very monasteries Henry had dissolved years earlier. It was an irony so sharp that later chroniclers could not resist remarking upon it. The king who had torn down shrines and scattered monks now lay in vigil beneath the roof of a house he himself had despoiled. But it was not irony that burned this stop into memory, it was horror. By dawn, rumours spread that the coffin had burst. The story told and retold in hushed tones was that the immense pressure of gases building within Henry's corpse had split the seams of the lead casket during the night. Putrid fluids leaked onto the chapel floor, seeping into cracks in the stone. Guards, overcome by the stench, fled their posts. And when they returned at first light, they found dogs in the chapel lapping at the foul puddles left by the dead king. The image was too powerful for propagandists to resist. Catholic chroniclers abroad seized on it as divine retribution proof that the king who had broken from Rome had been humiliated by God in death. To them, the dogs were more than animals. They were judgment itself, stripping Henry of dignity, reducing the self-styled supreme head of the Church of England to carrion. But can it be believed skeptics point out that lead coffins are not easily split, though accounts of bulging and leaking under pressure are plausible? The story of the dogs may have been embroidered by enemies eager to stain his memory. Propaganda in the 16th century travelled as swiftly as rumour, and Henry's enemies had every reason to amplify scandal into legend. Yet even if the tale is exaggerated, its endurance speaks to a truth deeper than fact. Henry's body was rotting at such a pace that containment itself had become a losing battle. Whether or not hounds truly licked the seepage attendants faced fluid stench and shame too great to disguise. For those who loved him, the memory would be one of indignity they could never cleanse. For those who hated him, it was poetic justice. For us centuries later, it is a reminder that beneath crowns and banners, beneath Holbein's colossus, lay the same vulnerable flesh as any man subject to decay stripped of grandeur. At Sion Abbey, history blurred into myth. Perhaps the dogs were real, perhaps they were invention. What cannot be doubted is that a king who once seemed immortal lay in a coffin that hissed, bulged, and wept with corruption. The human indignity of that night, whether witnessed by monk soldiers or scavenging animals, clings still to his legend, as foul and unforgettable as the stench that haunted the air. When the procession finally reached Windsor on February the 14th, the great pageant of royal burial was supposed to unfold a spectacle of banners, choirs, and solemn grandeur befitting a monarch who had ruled for nearly 4 decades. Yet Henry VIII was interred without the splendour that his reign had promised. The reality of his decaying body forced a swift and muted burial ceremony, scaled back so drastically that contemporaries quietly remarked on the absence of magnificence. The coffin, bulging and groaning with the strain of its contents, was lowered into the vault of St. George's Chapel, placed beside Jane Seymour, the Queen who had given him his only legitimate son. For some, this was fitting a gesture of dynastic closure. For others, it was a quiet reminder that even the most powerful king in Christendom could not dictate the terms of his end. The rites were curtailed, incense heavy in the air, courtiers pale with the memory of the journey that had preceded this final act. The Privy Council moved quickly to suppress any hint of scandal. Witnesses were sworn to silence on pain of death. Chroniclers attached to the court wrote of a burial rich with dignity and reverence the king remembered as a pious monarch who departed peacefully. Orders went out to erase traces of the grotesque truth, the splitting coffin, the stench, the frantic embalming. Official records smoothed over the ugliness, crafting a narrative that fit the dignity of the crown rather than the reality of the corpse. But paper is never watertight. Fragments slipped through letters from foreign ambassadors to their sovereigns describing the king's great corpulence and the strange odour that accompanied the procession. Private diaries of attendants whispering about cracked lead and leaking fluids. Catholic polemicists abroad gleefully retelling the tale of dogs lapping at royal remains. These voices scattered across Europe preserved a counter-history. Henry remembered not as the towering figure of Holbein's portrait, but as a man undone by his own body. Thus 2 Henrys were buried at Windsor, the official king laid to rest with all appropriate honours, and the remembered king whispered about in corridors and foreign courts, a monarch whose corpse betrayed him. One was the Henry England, needed to remember a symbol of continuity of divine authority. The other was the Henry England, feared to admit a decaying tyrant his death as grotesque as his reign had become. In the vault at St. George's, silence covered the coffin. Above ground, silence was commanded by decree. Yet memory does not obey orders. Across letters and legends, across dispatches and whispered tales, the truth flickered on, impossible to bury. The myth was interred, but the smell of the man lingered. The death of Henry VIII was not only the end of a man, but the unmasking of a system that had conspired for years to hide his decline. His rotting body forced into view truths that power had tried to veil, that monarchy is not immortal, that sovereignty can be betrayed by flesh, and that the most elaborate rituals cannot forever suppress the smell of decay. For decades, Henry's body had been both throne and battlefield. It was through his athletic frame and dazzling presence that he first won the adoration of Europe. It was through his wounds and fevers that policy twisted into paranoia and bloodshed. His ulcers drafted death warrants as surely as his hand. His pain was England's pain. His hallucinations became its politics. Rarely has a single body weighed so heavily upon a kingdom. Yet the collapse did not topple the institution. Image outshouted truth. Holbein's portraits still stare down at us, wide stance, commanding gaze colossus of will. The court orchestrated illusion with architecture reinforced floors, widened doorways, pulleys hidden behind tapestries. Priests swung censers heavy with incense, musicians played at banquets where the king raged at ghosts, ambassadors were shown only the sunlit angles. Together, medicine, art and ritual colluded to maintain sovereignty's fiction, even as the sovereign himself rotted within it. That fiction endured for centuries. Schoolbooks once told of a king who died peacefully surrounded by reverence. The stench, the split coffin, the desperate embalmers, these were excised, scrubbed from official memory. Only scraps survived in letters and private notes, fragments of a truth too indecorous for chronicles. Power depends on silence as much as on armies, and Henry's council understood this well. They buried not only a king, but his corruption sealing both in lead. And yet the smell lingers, not in the air of Whitehall long since rebuilt, but in the historical record where suppressed voices still whisper. To read them is to step back into that corridor where courtiers gagged and fainted to inhale the odour of mortality no crown can disguise. The stench that opened this story was more than a physical phenomenon. It was the smell of truth trying to escape the coffin built to contain it. Naming it matters, because in Henry's story we see how power uses spectacle to mask fragility, how institutions bend themselves into contortions to preserve appearances, how human suffering can be transfigured into propaganda. But we also see the futility of it. No matter how much perfume was poured, no matter how heavy the lead decay spoke in the end, it forced its way into legend carried by rumour remembered in fragments and finally centuries later spoken aloud. The Golden Prince, who had once been all charm and vigour, became a monarch defined by rot, and in that transformation lies a lesson still sharp that no power, however absolute, can escape the body that bears it. The smell at Whitehall was not only the odour of a dying man, it was the scent of history itself, rancid, undeniable, demanding to be remembered. History often reaches us in polished portraits and gilded chronicles, but the story of Henry VIII's last years reminds us that behind every image lies a body frail, vulnerable and mortal. The king who once dazzled Europe with athletic vigour and Renaissance charm ended his life weighed down by infection, paranoia and decay. His courtiers built elaborate illusions to hide the truth, reinforced flaws, perfumed halls, portraits, painted to broadcast invincibility. Yet despite the masks, the reality of his failing body could not be contained. The smell of corruption seeped into Whitehall, and with it came the collapse of the myth he had spent a lifetime constructing. There are lessons here for more than students of Tudor history. The first is that appearances, no matter how carefully managed, cannot forever disguise reality. Henry's painters, tailors and ministers worked tirelessly to uphold an image of strength, but the truth of his suffering broke through first in whispers, then in legends, and finally in the historical record. In our own lives, the temptation to curate a perfect exterior, whether through reputation, possessions, or digital facades, is strong. Yet the inner truth, our health, our character, our relationships will eventually reveal itself. Investing in the inner life is far wiser than polishing the mask. The second lesson is the danger of power untempered by vulnerability. Before his accident, Henry displayed charm and moderation. Afterward, his pain and paranoia shaped decisions that cost lives and destabilized a kingdom. His story warns us how unchecked suffering, unacknowledged and untreated, can spread outward, warping our choices and harming those around us. Today we may not command scaffolds or thrones, but our unspoken wounds, whether physical, emotional or spiritual, can still echo in our families, workplaces and communities. To face those wounds honestly is an act not of weakness, but of responsibility. Another truth emerges in the choreography of concealment. Courtiers fearful for their own survival reinforced the lie rather than risk speaking truth to power. They built a theatre of obedience that allowed Henry's paranoia to rule unchecked. This reminds us of the importance of integrity and courage when institutions, leaders, or even loved ones drift into self-destruction. Silence may feel safer in the moment, but it often allows rot to spread. Honest words, however costly, are the only antidote to illusions that harm both the powerful and those they govern. Finally, Henry's end underscores the universality of mortality. Here was a man who bent the church to his will, who commanded armies and redefined a nation's faith, yet his body failed him as inexorably as any peasant's. No crown could stop decay, no wealth could buy back health. This humbling fact invites us to reconsider our priorities. What truly endures is not the illusion of invincibility, but the legacy of how we treat others, the compassion we show, and the truths we dare to name. Henry VIII's stench-filled corridors are centuries behind us, yet their meaning remains fresh. They tell us that masks always crack, that wounds always demand recognition, and that power without humility becomes tragedy. To live wisely is to heed those lessons now, to nurture truth, care for our frailties, and remember that every life, whether crowned or common, is bound by the same human limits. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.